All right, hello, here we are again. Today, well, last class we talked about at length. I'm sorry about that. I'm not going to, well, maybe I will. But I'm going to try not to be as long as I was last lecture. But either way, last lecture we spent a lot of time talking about America's first attempt at self-government. Didn't go very well. But, hey, in life there's second chances, and in this case our founding fathers are going to come together one more time to try to pull it all together, and they're going to take a second shot at self-government, hence the title of the lecture. So now today it's going to be really important to look at. I want to really take some time to look at the value of compromise between competing political philosophies shaping the American government. When the Articles of Confederation fell apart, a lot of different people had to come together to make decisions on how are we going to actually create a government that actually works. And a lot of people had very different ideas. There's a variety of ideas involved in this. So we're going to take a look at some of those. This is going to deal with Key Concepts 3.1.3 and 3.2 point C and D in your AP guide. All right, well, here's the deal. Clearly the Articles of Confederation were not working, and the Founding Fathers decided that they had to come up with a different plan. This just wasn't working out. So they all met in Annapolis and decided, well, exactly what is it that we want to do? And they finally decided, look, we've got to come up with a way of amending the Articles of Confederation. So why don't we meet in Philadelphia and start this process of amending the Articles, which was going to be a very difficult process because if you remember, the Articles of Confederation require unanimous vote in order to be amended. So these guys are saying we really can't deal with that anymore. What we're going to do is we're going to come together with a special convention, a constitutional convention, to take a look at the Constitution of our government. So this was done in Annapolis, and they're going to come together in Philadelphia. What do I mean by they? Who's they? Well, they are your upper class. They are your very wealthy merchants. They are your large landowners. They were people who largely believed in Republican government. In other words, a non-monarchical government, a government with some kind of a representative body. But these were not your political liberals or your Democrats, small d Democrats, that we kind of touched upon last class, and we're going to dig into a little bit more deeply later on. These were your folks who tended to be a little bit more conservative, not so revolutionary, and they are the folks who are going to come in and develop this Constitution. Who's left out? Non-property owners. Black folks, women. These guys did not show up in the Constitutional Convention, largely because they were not invited. Fortunately, one guy who was invited is this fellow here, James Madison. And why is this blue? This should be red. It's the magic pen. Okay, anyway, James Madison. James Madison is going to play a key role. Now, we haven't talked about him very much. He's going to kind of blossom. He's a kind of a protege of Thomas Jefferson, who tended to be a lot more liberal and a lot more democratic. And he's going to be very important in understanding the Constitution and how the Constitution came to be. The Constitution was decided upon behind closed doors. The public didn't have any input while the Constitutional Convention was taking place. It was done in secret. Why do we know so much about the formation of the Constitution? Is because of the notes that James Madison kept. And he was a tireless advocate for the creation of this Constitution. Also, very important to this is our buddy George Washington. George Washington will become the presiding officer over the Constitutional Convention. His job was to make sure that the meeting was being run in an effective way. All right. Well, we run into a problem. Our first problem is, all right, we're going to have this representative body. We're going to have this Congress, so to speak. Well, how is this Congress going to be set up? And James Madison was from Virginia. He was a slave owner, a large plantation owner, and he came up with a plan that is going to become known as the Virginia Plan. In this case, the Congress would be a two-chambered Congress. In other words, there will be two separate houses, and a law will have to get through both of those houses in order for it to pass. But those two houses would have what we call proportional representation. In other words, people in those offices would represent the population as a whole. So they would, for every say 20,000 people in your particular state, you'd get a representative in this two-chamber body. So you would have a House that was popularly elected, and you would have a Senate that was appointed by your state legislature, and the number of people that you would have representing your state was dependent upon the size of your particular state. Well, that's great if you're a big state like Virginia, who has lots and lots of people. But what about a small state like New Jersey? New Jersey. Those New Jerseyans came in and said, whoa, wait a minute. Well, you know, they're Jerseys. They don't play. So we're not for this. Wait, what you're saying is that you big states are always going to be able to outvote us little states. And the interest of you big states are always going to win out over the interest of our little states. That's not going to happen. What we want is to have a single chamber in which all of the states are equally represented. You know, New Jersey gets the same number of representatives in this chamber as Virginia, as Massachusetts, as little bitty Rhode Island. All of us get the same representation. That is fair. Well, but then Virginia kind of has a point. Why should if everybody has an equal representation, then basically individuals who lived in New Jersey ended up with greater representation than individuals who lived in Virginia. That's not fair. And this became a huge fight, huge problem. And ultimately it will be resolved. James Madison will take a central role in this, in coming up with what was called the Great Compromise. There's going to be a lot of compromises throughout American history, but this one's known as the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise basically said, okay, look, we're going to go with that two-chamber plan. We're going to have a House and we're going to have a Senate. And the Senate will be selected by the state legislatures, and you will have equal representation in the Senate. The House of Representatives will be decided upon democratically by voters, those who are qualified to vote, which of course meant propertied white males, and this would be a proportionate body. So the number of representatives in the House of Representatives would represent the size of your population. Consequently, you would have more people in the House than you would have in the Senate. Also, this Great Compromise came up with this idea of, look, we're going to have to find a way of balancing the power. We have to have a stronger federal government. We just have to. But we also have to protect the rights and the powers of the states. So the Great Compromise came up with, look, we're going to find a way to balance the powers of the federal government with the powers of the states. It was not that the Founding Fathers wanted to come together and have a weak central government and strong states. They'd already had that. It didn't work. But they are going to have to try to figure out, wait a minute, just how powerful should the federal government be and how much of that power should devolve to the states. Also related to this Great Compromise was another compromise, which we may not necessarily approve of, but it is what they did, and perhaps for well, I wouldn't say good reasons, but certainly for, maybe out of necessity. Something that is called the Three-Fifths Compromise. Not a proud moment in our history, but it is what it is. The Three-Fifths Compromise. Southerners were saying, hey, when we elect people proportionately, we would like to have our slave population included in that proportionate representation. So so that we get more representatives in the House of Representatives. Well, wait a minute, you're going to count your slaves as being represented in the House of Representatives? Well, yeah, we're going to represent our slaves. What could possibly go wrong? The northern states that were largely non-slave states at this stage of the game were saying, whoa, wait a minute, no. You don't get to do that. You're not going to let these slaves vote. Another thing that the southern states wanted is, we don't want you to count those slaves when it comes to taxation and federal taxes. We don't want that, but we do want to have representatives. So this would be a case of actually, representation without taxation. Some interesting little twists on a theme here. The northern states are not going for that. So finally, they do end up saying, all right, here's what we're going to do. What we want is we want the federal government to be able to regulate commerce between the states. We don't want to have one individual state buying and selling with other countries and then charging taxes to other states. No, federal government is going to be the one that is going to regulate commerce. Southern states didn't much particularly care for that. All right, so what we'll do is, what we're going to take is, we're going to say, in exchange for this what we call a commerce clause, we will count every slave in your state as being 3/5 of a person. So for every 5 states, 5 slaves, you can count them as 3 people, 3 individuals, and they can be represented in the House of Representatives. This becomes known as the 3/5ths Compromise. A couple other provisions were also added at, kind of as an adjunct of this 3/5ths Compromise. For instance, it is going to be added to the Constitution that if a slave escapes from a slave state and travels into a non-slave state, then according to the Constitution, the non-slave state has to, catch this slave and bring him back to his original owners. It's a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. What's the second one? Also, additionally, in the Constitution, my brain just locked up. Anyway, the Fugitive Slave Act and the right to keep slaves was not going to be denied in the Constitution. So slavery is going to be legitimized by the Constitution. So finally, these guys, they do in fact come up with a basic structure of government. The government is going to be divided up with 3 branches of government: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. The executive branch will be responsible for enforcement of laws, maintenance of the defense, to negotiate treaties with foreign countries, and things along those lines. But the executive branch would not have the power to create laws, would not have the power to declare war, would not have the power to make actual decisions with regard to the legal structure. Their job is going to be to enforce the laws. The legislative branch, on the other hand, would be the one that is responsible for passing the laws. The legislative branch creates the laws, but does not necessarily have the enforcement power there. The legislative branch is also responsible for declaring war and for supervising the executive branch during military exercises. So the executive, the president in this case, is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but he has to run things according to the consent of Congress. And then finally, a judicial branch, and this judicial branch would take care of any kind of legal issues that have to do with interstate stuff. States would be allowed to maintain their own court systems, but there are sometimes, for instance, if a person in Georgia has a problem with a person in South Carolina, which state do you deal with that in? Well, that's going to be decided in federal courts, and there were certain things that are going to have to be dealt with in federal courts. A Supreme Court would be established for the sake of arbitration and for taking care of things that weren't ultimately taken care of. They would have the final legal say. They were kind of your ultimate appeal in this case. And finally, all of the powers that were not delineated to the Constitution would go to the states. So states were able to, anything that happened within their state, they dealt with. You know, they set up their own state roads. They would set up their own state systems. You know, so on the other hand, when the federal government did need to move in, when it was a federal matter, the states were expected to kind of back out and let the federal government take care of what it needed to take care of. So you see here where the Founding Fathers are trying to create this balance, and they also created a system that had been thought up by the French philosopher Montaigne, called checks and balance, where each of these branches is going to act as a check and as a stopgap for the other branches. Finally, we have to get this Constitution ratified. We have to approve it. And there were quite a few people who did not necessarily like this Constitution. Of course, you can't satisfy everybody. And the Founding Fathers largely recognized that the Constitution was not, in fact, a perfect document. Here we have a quote from Benjamin Franklin, in which he's saying, "Can a perfect production be expected?" And ultimately he says, "Hey, look, I consent, sir, to this Constitution because I expect no better, and because I'm not sure that it is not the best." All right, this was a pretty common theme. Many of the people who did ultimately vote for the Constitution voted for it because they knew that we needed a Constitution. There were probably things that they didn't like, that they would rather see not be there, but they voted for it. It's very interesting. Just to kind of give you my own personal aside on this, this is perfectly, totally a state of opinion. But we do have folks who look at the Constitution as a perfect document, as you know, this should be followed as strictly as written. The Founding Fathers, some of them thought that way, but for the most part, the Founding Fathers did not necessarily think that this was a perfect document. They believed that it was the best they could do at the time, and there wasn't going to be anything better than that. But they did create provisions in the Constitution to amend the document as necessary, as needed, and as we could figure out some of our differences. The folks who supported this document were known as the Federalists, became known as the Federalists, and ultimately there will actually be a Federalist Party that's going to develop, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. The Federalists were well represented by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And they are going to come together to write some articles in favor of support of, because the Constitution had to be ratified by the states, by 9 of the states, before it could be could apply as a governing document. So Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, started publishing and started printing papers defending the Constitution and promoting the Constitution as the best possible outcome from this convention. These papers were compiled and put into a book, which you can still get. It's also a good idea to get it, called the Federalist Papers. However, where there are Federalists, you're going to have folks who are going to disagree, and those people who disagreed were called the Anti-Federalists. Well, okay, that's not very original, but it is what it is. The Anti-Federalists were saying, wait a minute. Sometimes they had a little bit, sometimes the Anti-Federalists had some different ideas. Some of your Anti-Federalists said, look, this was a document that was created by landowners to protect landowners. And what is going to happen as a result of this document is we are going to end up with a two-tier system, a system of the elite oppressing the not-so-elite. There was the fear of that. Also, the Anti-Federalists, many of the Anti-Federalists believed that this Constitution provided for a federal government that was too strong, that ultimately the federal government in this case would become oppressive. So they were against the ratification of the document as well. And in fact, this was a huge problem. In many, like North Carolina, Rhode Island, these states were very hesitant to sign on to the Constitution. Ultimately, one of the things that's going to come about on this is, hey, look, we need something added to the Constitution that is going to protect individual rights and individual freedoms, and we don't see that in the Constitution. So, folks like John Jay and James Madison said, hey, look, pass the Constitution, one of the first things that we will do is we will add a Bill of Rights. The first thing we will do with the Constitution is change it. We will amend it so that there is a Bill of Rights that protects the rights of the people. And ultimately, enough states will ratify the Constitution, and Congress will take session, and among the first things that it does is pass a Bill of Rights. Now, they had all kinds of bills of rights that were put in front of them. They had something like 200 different rights that had kind of descended upon them from all of the states that people demanded be added to the Constitution. And the Founding Fathers kind of boiled that down to 10 main rights that they included. In fact, some of these rights have multiple rights within it. So, for instance, the First Amendment talks about the right to free speech, the right to religion, and the freedom of the press. So that's kind of one, three rights all kind of pressed into one there. But either way, the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. Amendments 1 through 8 tend to look at the rights of individuals. The right to speak, the right to be secure in your belongings, the right to be secure in your homes, the right to a jury trial, all that other kind of good stuff. Amendment 9 says, hey, look, there's a whole bunch of other rights that people like. We didn't include in the Constitution, but just because it's not in the Constitution doesn't mean that those rights are not protected. Look, if you have a right to something in your individual state that isn't, noticed or looked at in the federal Constitution, the federal Constitution is still going to protect that right. And the 10th Amendment, which is going to say, hey, look, anything that we don't talk about in the Constitution devolves onto the states. The states take care of this. So this was the states' rights amendment to the Constitution. Moving along. How much time have I gotten here? Okay, 21 minutes. Not too bad. All right, so now the very first administration is going to be the administration of George Washington. Of course, everybody knows that George Washington was the very first president of the United States. And a very significant president of the United States. Because this was kind of the make or break administration. It all kind of rested on George Washington's shoulders, and Washington was a bit hesitant to take on this responsibility, but he was overwhelmingly selected. There wasn't really an election in the popular kind of sense of the term. Remember that the president is not chosen by popular vote. He's chosen by electoral votes. And it was pretty much unanimous that Washington would take charge. Washington becomes president. Now what do I do? Well, you have to come up with a plan. And one of the first things, of course, that he puts into place is the presidential cabinet. This is not called for in the Constitution. He does not have to do this, but he did it anyway. His cabinet, of course, included the vice president, a fellow by the name of John Adams, whom we've talked about before. But he also wanted somebody who was going to help him with foreign relations, foreign affairs. That person became the Secretary of State, the person in charge of taking charge of diplomacy with foreign countries. And his very first Secretary of State will, of course, be Thomas Jefferson. You also needed somebody to secure the finances. Oh, man, American finances at this point are just absolute freaking shambles. You needed to have somebody who was really, really competent to be your Secretary of Treasury and take care of the national finances. And George Washington found that in his protege, a fellow by the name of Alexander Hamilton, one of our most brilliant, founding fathers. He's going to be the very first Secretary of Treasury. For Secretary of War, you got to do that. You got the British up in Canada. You've got the Spanish who are ticked off and they want chunks of Alabama. You've got ticked off Indians in the West. You got to get yourself a Secretary of War. Not a Secretary of Defense, mind you. A Secretary of War. And this is going to be Henry Knox. And then finally, ultimately, we're going to have a Secretary of Justice, a guy who's going to be in charge of supervising the laws of the nation itself. And this will be a fellow by the name of Edmund Randolph. Now, among the very first tests of this new administration was, guess what? A tax issue. Taxes. Gosh. Anyway, Congress is going to pass a tax on distilled whiskey that is distilled from corn. There are plenty of corn farmers, especially out there in the West, And, well, you didn't have refrigerators back then, so a lot of these farmers would sell whatever corn they could, and the corn that they could not sell, they would distill into whiskey. So what the Congress said is, let's raise some revenue by taxing whiskey, because people who want whiskey are going to pay the tax, right? Well, the corn growers, who were largely small farmers, were saying, well, wait a minute. Wait, why don't we tax land speculation? And that way there, large landowners like, oh, I don't know, we'll have to pay taxes. What you're doing to us is you are putting a tax on us that is unfair. It only hits small farmers. Large plantation owners growing tobacco and hemp are not having to pay a tax. That's not cool. And, well, yeah, they're kind of right. It was a regressive tax. In other words, it was a tax that disproportionately was being paid by lower class people. There was some uprisings and some riots going on, so George Washington immediately raised an army of about 13,000 soldiers, went into the western regions that were uprising, and slammed it, smashed it. Captured a whole bunch of the leaders, but ultimately, once the uprising was put down, then Washington forgave and gave clemency to all of the people who rose up, and basically told them to go home, pay the tax, and shut up. And that's what they did. So, ironically, the very, very first challenge of this brand new government after the American Revolution was a tax issue, and it was resolved by crushing the tax uprising. Ironies abound in American history. Another great accomplishment was something called Jay's Treaty. Now, this wasn't necessarily considered a great accomplishment at the time, but it was very important. And what this basically said is, look, British people, stop taking sailors off of our ships, and we'll continue to do business with you. It was, in essence, kind of an alliance between the United States and Britain, which, of course, ticked a lot of people off, and they felt that John Jay had kind of sold the country out to the British. Some other accomplishments that came out of this time period: the Judiciary Act of 1789 is going to set up the Supreme Court and the court system, and John Jay will become the very, very first Supreme Court Justice. We will set up we're going to start playing around with a concept called judicial review. Now, this is not in the Constitution, but some folks would say that it is implied by the Constitution, that the Supreme Court would be the ultimate arbiter deciding whether or not laws passed by Congress were constitutional. This would be the ultimate check against tyranny, against unconstitutional laws. Again, not in the Constitution, but maybe something that we kind of need. So this is the idea of judicial review, that the Supreme Court can judge the constitutionality of congressional laws. A tariff was passed in 1789 that was set high enough to kind of provide some revenue for the government, which needed revenue, but not so high that it actually provided protection for American manufacturers and merchants. This was kind of a compromise bill, a very important compromise bill. The the Intercourse Act of 1789. The Intercourse Act of 1789 is going to say, look, it's going to be the federal government is going to be in charge of dealing with Indians. The state of Virginia isn't going to be able to do it. The state of Maryland, whatever state we're talking about. No, the federal government is going to be in charge of interacting here with Native Americans. Ultimately, Native Americans will find themselves on the short end of that interaction as American soldiers are going to be brought into these territories. Native American militaries are going to suffer a tremendous defeat at the Battle of Fallen Timbers and pretty much be forced into signing the Treaty of Grenville, which is going to concede millions of acres of territory to the United States. And finally, but not the least, George Washington will ultimately serve 2 terms. He could have served as many terms as he wanted, but he probably did one of the most important things that he could have done for this new republic. He stepped down. And this is absolutely crucial. This set the precedent for all future presidents, to finally leave office, to serve your time, to serve your terms, and then to leave office before you could accumulate too much power. George III actually said, is quoted as saying, if George Washington steps down. He will become the greatest man since Cincinnatus, the famous dictator of Rome, who was given total power of Rome to handle a particular incursion and foreign threat. And then once that foreign threat was taken care of, instead of grasping onto power, he stepped down from power and returned to his farm, picking up his plow as he left it laying on the ground. George Washington will, in fact, step down. Very, very important, and he is going to give what becomes known as the Washington's Farewell Address, in which he says a lot of good stuff. He largely says in this farewell address, hey, look, don't get involved in European entanglements. Don't get involved in foreign wars. Stay neutral. It's probably the biggest piece of advice he had, and for the most part, the United States is going to follow that advice right up until World War I. Well, maybe the Spanish-American War. But either way, but I wanted to focus on another issue that George Washington brought up. He's looking around and he's seeing a lot of political arguments going along in his 8 years. Factions are starting to develop between the people who are following the political ideas of Thomas Jefferson and his more democratic ideas, and the folks who are following folks like Alexander Hamilton with his more federalist, strong central government ideas. And he's getting a little nervous about this. He's thinking this is kind of like factionalism, and ultimately it's going to weaken the country. He writes in his farewell address, the alternate dominion of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetuated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. You don't need to have a dictator or a monarch to have a despotism. You can have a party system. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual, and sooner or later the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Wow. What he's talking about here is political parties and political factions that are rising during his time, and he sees this as a danger to American liberty. Will he be right?